We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. We're glad you're with us. Today we have with us Matthew Host. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Matthew is an applied associate professor of philosophy and assistant dean at the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. You'd have to have an extra large business card to have all that on there, wouldn't you? Uh,
Well, and then there's, other titles that could go on there, therapist. Sometimes people need a shoulder to cry on, so.
Oh, that's funny. Well, Matthew, before we get started, I always like for people to get to know our guests. So tell us a little bit about your family, your education, and your career that led you to this point.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking, Marlon. So, in terms of my family, I'm from Canada originally, and I'm still a Canadian citizen. I'm descended from farmers, really, on both sides of the family. And on one side, coming from Belgium and England and Ireland, and apparently I look exactly like my Irish great-grandfather. So those genes are strong, at least in terms of the visual presentation. And then on my father's side, they're all Dutch, and if you ask them, they literally came out of the earth in northern Holland. And they came to Canada shortly after World War II. So, and my grandfather actually fought in World War II in the liberation of Amsterdam, actually.
Wow.
So, these, as you guys know, these are the kinds of things that kind of shape you as a child. When you hear these stories of courage and sacrifice, but also you see that there's a price. Like my grandfather had to sleep with a light on, and he had night terrors. And so so there's a lot in my family. I think all of us have this, right? If you poke into it, there's a deep history there, and a lot to be learned about character. And beyond that, I would say you asked a little bit about education. When I was young, I wanted to be a writer or maybe an artist. So then I settled on the more lucrative philosophy discipline. So
Is
it's
there a
like
little
just a lot
sarcasm
of,
there?
so- yeah. No way was I ever going to make money from an early age. It was clear. But there was a brief period where I wanted to be a doctor, and I did actually begin a little bit of the studies in that direction, and was always did much better in math and the maths and sciences than I did in humanities disciplines. But I don't know. There was just something about uh, when I was 18, 19 was when we don't have a liberal arts tradition in Canada. So it was when I was 18 or 19, I first encountered um, Homer or a more careful way of reading scripture. I went to church as a kid, and so I was familiar with scripture. But I hate to say it's just you're a kid. It was a bit more of a superficial treatment. There's no criticism of anyone implied by that. But in university, that's where we did a deeper dive with scripture as well. And there's something about that I just fell in love with. And therefore, my brief flirtation with a more honorable profession in our society was over. So, but I have absolutely no regrets. I would say it saved my soul, so
Well,
I'm very grateful for it.
how do you explain your interest in the humanities, in the great books in particular, from that background? What really captured your imagination?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'd say it's a couple of things. One is that when I was in the middle school years, my grandmother gave me a book of Greek myths. And actually, I am maybe technically first generation university. Neither of my parents completed college, but my grandmother did get a degree in philosophy as part of a program to educate housewives. Um, and actually, to be fair, she wasn't. She did actually work. She worked for the Canadian government as an administrative assistant. But in any event, she had this deep love of the tradition. of its roots, of its great stories, and also a great love of philosophy. And she always encouraged me to be very thoughtful about things. But so I say that, I think it is this for many people, right? It's someone in your family who believes in you and inspires you and helps cultivate intellectual and moral and spiritual virtues in you. And that was my grandmother. And actually, I have a daughter, and I'm grateful to have named her after my grandmother.
Okay. Wow, that's wonderful. So your work at the University of Tulsa is primarily with undergraduates and primarily with the great books. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
How would you unpack that? Tell me about your students.
Yeah, so at the University of Tulsa, there's really an extraordinary range of students, in the sense that you have students who are uh, that have deep faith commitments and of different Christian denominations, and occasionally a Jewish student or a Muslim student. And then you have some that are just trying to figure things out, and then you have some who are more confidently on the side of being atheists. And you also have a broad spectrum in terms of political views. And, when you think about the university experience, I've taught in different circumstances. I've taught in classes where pretty much every student they're at least part of the same Christian tradition, even if they disagreed about details. And, that can be very beautiful, a community with that kind of shared faith, and common language and common understanding of things, very Christ-centered approach to everything, which is extremely important. At the same time, though, if I may put it this way, I would never compare myself to the apostles, just because I'm very, very far from their standard. But I would say this, that even so, their lives were not dedicated to just, oh, well, now we found the people who agree with us were good, right? They went out into the world, to spread the message. And the question is, how does one do that today? And one of those ways might be to teach in a program where you have a great diversity of people who don't necessarily see any value in the Western tradition. Um, they don't think there is anything sacred, right? Some do, some don't, as I just said. And so one of the things I really appreciate about my work at the University of Tulsa is being in a position to help introduce students to these things. And you could say, well, for the ones who don't know anything about it, it's clear what the value is to us. It's not clear to them, though. They need a little bit of time to encounter it, right? But what about for those who already have a classical background, or a deep faith? And I would say it's actually valuable for them too, and in two ways. One is that, we say these are works that are perennial and they have deep wisdom. So the notion that, to use Plato as an example, well, we read some Plato's Republic in high school, so we did that. It's like, well, human beings have been going back to that well fruitfully for over 2,000 years. So it's no criticism of the high school that maybe a few weeks spent on it didn't plumb all of its depths, right?
Right.
So there's more to be done there. But the other thing I would say that is some value to those students is that if they're going to be out in the world, which they are, right, at some point, it will be helpful for them to meet people who may disagree with them vehemently on things. And our classroom is a place where they can learn how to navigate those discussions. And thinking also of classical education, thinking through grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which is essential to how we communicate to others, civil discourse, handling things with grace, which even as adults might be difficult, right? So
We have certainly
it's
seen examples of difficulty in recent years.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So and where will the healing begin? I mean, with us certainly, but I think also with what we try to pass on to the younger generation. So anyway, my apologies for speaking at such great length, but those are some of the things I would say I think are valuable about the kinds of conversations we have here, and what an encounter with great books and with respect for the sacred can give.
Now, I'm asking you a question for our audience. I don't know how you'll answer it. I have my own answers for this, but why is it that the great books become the subject matter that allows us to learn how to relate today?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say there's two or three things. I mean, one of them is, what makes a great book. And I remember years ago, essentially being challenged on this with respect to the Twilight novels. Why aren't they great books, And you could say, well, the Iliad gets into this wonderful mythology, and they're like, well, Twilight has mythology. And you're like, yeah, but it's a real mythology. No, vampires and werewolves are real mythology. And you're like, actually, no, that's true. But the Iliad talks about real things, like human relationships, conflict, love, heartbreak. No, apparently Twilight has that too. I haven't actually read the novels, but I believe when the student tells me it has that,
Yeah.
it does
Yeah.
have that. Um, and then you can say, well, it stood the test of time. But the truth is, there are bad things which stand the test of time. Standing the test of time isn't strictly speaking a measure of goodness. So then I had to kind of go back to the drawing board and think about this a little bit more. And what I came up with is that, for example, in Plato's Republic, there's this discussion of the different parts of the soul, and depending on which part of that text you look at, there can be more or less parts, to be honest with
Okay.
you.
Right.
Some people think it's just three. It's more complicated than that. But certainly one part of the soul has to do with intellectual vision, a way by which you can actually see the truth with your mind. Another part has to do with speech and the kinds of things that you can learn through calculation. So, for example, quadrivial arts and the kinds of things that you can learn through literary or the spoken word, so the trivial arts. Another part of it has to do with our passions and with our desires. And then ultimately, I think another factor there is love and the power of it in drawing us toward truth, or when misdirected, drawing us toward destruction. And I think that what makes for a great book in this context is something which illuminates all of those parts of the human soul and also draws it toward an activity of harmonizing. I don't just say harmony, because actually, at least for most of us, it's harmony isn't just a stillness, right? There actually are
It's
chaotic
dynamic.
things
It's
that we
not
encounter.
static. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And even a table that you look at that seems to be just sitting there is being maintained by incredible forces. And then for someone who has faith, that it's actually being maintained by the will and eternal creative power of God, right? So there's a lot more going on there than appears at first. So some works that we read really do illuminate every part of the soul, and some of them only illuminate some parts and not others. So if you read a book that, you know, stirs your passions or your appetites, that might be helpful in certain ways. There's nothing wrong with reading something that helps you relax. Um, but when you read something that illuminates every part of you, and it might be very challenging, it actually might be much less pleasant to read. But it's something which, for various reasons, at a deeper level, transforms you. And even if there's a hard slog, at some point you look back and you're like, I'm really, really glad I read that. That's a great book. And the reason why it helps us to connect, to kind of get back to your point, is because it illuminates us and challenges us. It is something that I actually think you can read on your own. But I think one of the great things that emerges from a great book is you do want to talk to someone about it. You want to share it.
Yeah.
And when you talk to them, you find they disagree. And then in those disagreements, you go back to the book and you realize it was deeper than you thought at first. So it's a continuous practice of challenging yourself, having to listen to someone else, having to rethink what it was you said, and then going back to the source. And I think that what you see there is a dynamic that I would also consider deeply Christian in a way, in the sense that, you have a Christ-centered way of life. Most of us are not fully living up to it, but we are insufficient unto ourselves. So we need Christ, but we also need each other. And by working with each other, engaging with each other, being charitable, but also challenging each other, but always going back to that source, we take immense strength and find a life that is truly worth living. And I think that the education Great Books offers is like an image of that deeper Christian life.
Yeah, that's really well put. Now, my understanding is that you'll deal with students who are studying the classics, who are getting a degree that would fall into the liberal arts or community or humanities community, but you're also dealing with students who are engineering students and maybe other forms of education that is more directly tied to the career that they're seeking. Trying to do it, communicate this in a summarily. And one of the things that you mentioned was the idea that a student coming in, this isn't just junior high kids and high school kids that say this, college kids do. What's the benefit? Why am I studying this? They've taken this sense of pragmatism and applied it to their education. I don't think I will ever use this. Why am I studying this? How do
Yeah,
you answer them?
yeah, I know. So there's a lot of different ways of tackling it. And one thing I'll say that I think is important from the outset is, we kind of think about where does this pragmatism come from? And if you ever read George Orwell's essay, Such Were the Joys, it's interesting because he's essentially in one of these schools that some people in classical education dream of being a part of. But he describes it as utterly miserable because they do engage with these rich classics. They learn Latin, but they learn Latin for advancement in life. And so much of what he describes has to do with looking down on others and degrading others. And he talks about, if I'm getting this correctly, like you don't want to end up being an office boy for 20 pounds a year, right? And it's quite clear that just having the classics isn't good enough. Um, in fact, I think as scripture teaches us, nothing is revealed to human beings so good that we can't reject or pervert it immediately, right? If we set our twisted hearts to doing so. So it's important to understand where the rejection of the classics came from, which I would say isn't this or that terrible author. I think it's human sin, and it's the way we pervert good things, and people reject it, and then they say, well, you said the classics are so that I can get advancement in life. I can get advancement in life without them, So we need to recover them, and I think that's very important in classical ed. And I would say one of the first things that I kind of point out to students is, we might be reading Homer's Iliad, and we were talking about Achilles' dilemma. Should he avenge Patroclus and die young, but his name will live on forever, with the Kleos? Or should he go back with his Myrmidons and live with Briseis and, die many children, having lived a long time, but there will be no Kleos for him. There will be no glory. And I remember the students were like, yeah, this is Achilles' dilemma. And I said, Achilles' dilemma, it's not your dilemma. And they're like, well, no, I'm not like some king or chieftain in whatever this is, the ninth century BC or 8th century BC. And I said, right. I said, because you guys want to be the heads of hospitals or, leading some R&D division at Google or something like this. And I said, and you're just doing that out of pure interest. It has nothing to do with honor or what you think is most honorable in our society. And you don't think that your pursuit of that honor and that career will entail sacrifices. And that maybe if you wanted to live a life where you have your child in your lap and you're playing with them and you're surrounded by your family and a close-knit community, that actually having that might entail not having the honor of being some awesome tech entrepreneur or some. And, one of the girls in the class said, you're breaking my brain right now. with your questions. And she said, I'm becoming someone else and I don't know who it is. And because these are big questions, and they're also questions we have to face, even if they're on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
But some of the other things I've pointed out to them is, for example, years ago, an American airline, which I won't name, was wondering why a European airline was doing better than them, even though those tickets were more expensive. Oh, they hired consultants, paid them ridiculous amounts of money. Maybe 6 months or more went by, no one figured out why. And then finally, one of these consultants had the bright idea of looking at a photo of the inside of one of the planes of their competitors. And what they saw was that, first of all, there was more space between the seats. And also, the inside of the plane was aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I figured it out. It's just a better experience. And they went back to the American airline and said, we figured it out. If you just make it a better experience, you can charge more and you'll outdo your competitor. Maybe if you make it even nicer. And they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. But one of the interesting things about that is that it does tell you something about business, which is that, and I think it's very interesting, which is that, because this is an ancient insight, which is that if you pursue what is beautiful and good and true, what wealth you need will follow. This is also a claim from Scripture.
Right.
But if you pursue wealth,
Yeah.
then ugliness follows.
Yeah.
And even though that airline in Europe, I'm sure, cared more about money than it does about Christ, but the point is that in whatever little way they thought we can make this more beautiful and enjoyable, what that really means is they thought, how can we make this more humane?
Yeah. And
Um,
they understood in very real terms that connected to a better value, a better something that people were willing to pay more for. And it was, simply speaking, going to make them more profitable as a result. They got
yeah,
both by
they
pursuing the one that made the most sense.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Is it?
And you need to be formed to have that judgment. And I think a lot of what we do helps form this so that students can excel in their professions,
Yeah.
but they can do so in a way that doesn't have to compromise on having some aesthetic or moral or spiritual integrity, depending on the occasion.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, there's another element of this pragmatist that comes to you and says, what's the point of doing this? That I'd like to pursue a little bit with you here for a minute, or more than that,
Yeah.
probably. And that's the idea that the water in which we swim as Americans is very infected with pragmatism. So we're born into a pragmatic philosophy of life. It affects, most of education in my life, maybe in your life as well. You're a bit younger than me, but you're getting an education in order to get a job. It was very ordered. It was very precise. It was very intentional. And there was another element, and this one wasn't spoken as well, but it was part of it. You're being educated in order to be a good, compliant citizen of the United States. And so those two things, as opposed to being given an education that encouraged me to be free and to enjoy the life that God has given me. It was very pragmatic. So we're born into that. Does that impact the students that come to you with such pragmatic predispositions? How do you deal with that? And what are the kinds of students that have been able to break the chains of that a bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So beyond the career question, as you said, the political question, the citizenship question. So I think that on that level, and of course, since I come from Canada, I haven't had this same education in America, but I have heard some things about it, and
You're dealing
I would
with
say
it
two
though. Are
things.
you better equipped to deal with it, you think, for being from outside it?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
I think
maybe.
that's probably true.
Yeah, because there are certain debates here that I observe a little bit more from the outside, and sometimes someone will say, "Are you a Democrat or a Republican?" And I'll say, "Well, I'm a Canadian, so it's not. I don't have a
None of
right
the
to vote
above.
here." And I yeah, and I agree with not having a right to vote here. I mean, all citizens should have the right to vote, but non-citizens, I think, need to go through the process of joining that community formally, and then they have the right to vote, and I would be happy to do that as opportunity allows, because it's a bit of a process. But I will say this quickly about the political education. I think that maybe it takes kind of two forms. My impression is that, in the time of the Cold War, there was some importance in cultivating in young people a sense of, you know, you should have a loyalty to this community, to the United States. Now, so I do see how emerging from there a great interest in having citizens that are committed and loyal. But I would say this education seems to, in America particularly, people talk about how patriotic it is, but actually, if you look at it historically, it's very big on rebellion. I mean, you look at the
Interesting
60s,
observation. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you've actually, people are like, look what's going on campuses. And I'm like, well, the National Guard hasn't killed anyone yet. And it's not to say that what's going on campuses isn't of concern, but
Right.
it's just America has had plenty of tribulation, and has weathered it, by the way, which I think is important to note. But I think one of the tricks here, though, is that the rebellious nature uh, isn't always as rebellious as it seems. And it's interesting to talk to people who say, I'm fighting the power by talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm rejecting everything from the administration. And I know right now people say, well, that's true of the Trump administration. But 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20, you weren't actually fighting the administration. That was the mandate of the administration. And so that was being presented as something that was deeply rebellious, deeply critical, and which isn't to say there wasn't some critical thinking involved in this or that way, but it wasn't challenging the administration, um, and it's also very effective, I think. So, for example, in a place where I used to live, there was a school there in which, there was some controversy because of some kids who were administered a test to see if they had some kind of racial prejudice. And I believe the test just looked at how they responded to black colors and statements about darkness. And actually, the test is widely been refuted as a legitimate test for in any way assessing prejudice. But a teacher used this test, and she had a few students come to the front of the classroom who failed it, I say in quotation marks, and she shamed them. And I was talking to one of the parents from that school, and she said, well, this is overblown. This is ridiculous. This is one teacher in one classroom on one day. And I did a little trick. I turned to her child who was in that school, but not in that classroom, not in that grade, nothing. And I said, hey, did you hear about this thing? And he said, yeah. And I said, what do you think of it? And he said, those racist kids got what they deserved. Right. So the point is that that wasn't just one classroom, one teacher, one day. There's an ethos. And that ethos is an ethos that does in some way or another reflect the views of people in politics. And their understanding is that is what makes for a good citizen, is those views. And the people who disagree with them also have views about citizenship, and they also think that those things should be cultivated in young people, right? So on that ground, I don't think there's a difference necessarily. So I think that And I will add one thing. That is, I think, a little bit different from the founders. I think the founding generation and the generation that followed, being a bit closer to the revolution, were a lot more interested in education that was deeply suspicious of government in all of its forms. But that has changed over time.
It certainly has,
But
and it needs to.
oh yeah,
Just like the Christian experience, um,
yeah,
living as a believer, we don't have, you know, is it for us to go back to the New Testament church and live communally, or are there dynamic equivalents of the Christian community moving on from that into areas that are a bit different for lots of reasons? And I think those are things that really have to be thought through well. And I really am excited to see that you're helping to shape the next generation beyond K-12 into being people that are not only going to go into classical Christian educational professions like starting schools and being school administrators and being teachers, but being also mindful of what we can glean from the past in order to live in the present in a way that continues to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.
yeah. I mean, to whatever small degree God calls me or us or anyone to that work. Um, it can be very hard work. I think for myself, I fear that I will not live up to it, and I'm sure I don't in many ways. But fortunately, he's merciful too, pretty much endlessly merciful.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and he's always, as scripture keeps telling us, like a very loving parent, that every time you fall, he's there to help pick you back up. Um, but sometimes he also needs to chastise you a little bit for your own good. But yeah, it's a great privilege to be in this work. But one quick thing I'll add about the political education before moving on is just to say this, that, as a Canadian and as an outsider, when I see Americans, I mean, I'm not saying that in this spectrum of left to right, there aren't people on the extremes, um, who maybe on some level or another do yield to hate, which is painful to see, but one hopes that there'll be a redemption there at some point. But for people who aren't at those extremes, they point fingers at each other and say, you're this, you're that. And from my perspective, it's often really not true, or it's only partially true. And to kind of go back to the example of that high school I was giving, they're doing what they're doing because they think conservatives want to teach a version of America in which racism is brushed under the rug or even celebrated, or slavery is even celebrated. And I haven't seen that. But by the same token, conservatives think that people on the left have some totalitarian project. And it's not to say that there might not be some people who are like this, but a lot of the people you meet, what it really is for them is that they think there's an injustice out there. They think there are people who are being treated very badly. Their dignity is being stolen from them. And we may have some deep disagreements about how to understand that or what to do about it. But I think it's actually amazing. And I think genuinely a gift of God and of the divine image in us, that there are so many people that really are troubled by that loss of dignity.
That's a great
And that
observation.
if only we could get past that and realize we're arguing about means, not ends. And could kind of see in the other person that they actually are more loving and more compassionate than we believe at first. Maybe we could make a little bit of progress to understanding each other better, working together better on these things. I know it's naively hopeful,
Well,
but
those are wonderful things to pursue, and I get the feeling that you're doing a really good job of it. We've run out of time. This has been wonderful. We could go forever, but I need to bring this to a close. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew.
yeah, thank you so much,
Great to
Marlon.
have
I
you.
appreciate your
Folks,
patience.
yeah, thank you, folks, for joining us on another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. We hope to see you next time. Thanks, man.
Okay, thank you, Marlon.